The whole county begged him to walk away. Now he finally understands why. A retired veteran scraped together $500 to buy a haunted winter cabin in Minnesota, just praying for peace. But on the very first night, his old German shepherd refused to leave the stone fireplace alone. And when the dog began clawing at the hearth, they uncovered a hidden chamber sealed beneath the cabin floor. Inside it lay a secret buried for 15 years one powerful men were willing to kill to protect. What he found would ignite a scandal, expose a conspiracy, and change his life forever. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. The winter sky over Duluth hung low and heavy, a sheet of steel gray pressing down on the frozen city streets. Henry Walker sat on the hard wooden bench inside the St. Louis County Administrative Building. His breath slow and steady as if he were drawing calm from some deep place inside him that the world had long forgotten. At 68, he still held the posture of a man shaped by decades in uniform, shoulders square, spine straight, chin slightly raised, the stance of someone who had weathered more storms than he ever bothered to count. But his knees, they were the weak link, now always aching, always whispering reminders of the cold nights he had spent in foreign deserts and mountains half a lifetime ago. His hands, rough and scarred, rested on his thighs as he watched small flurries of snow drift past the tall courthouse windows, each flake catching the faint glow of the overhead lights like tiny dying sparks. By his feet lay Duke, the old German shepherd, who looked as though he had grown out of the winter itself. Duke was 11 years old now, his thick gray-black coat streaked with lighter fur that made him appear almost wolf-like from a distance. His body was powerful but slowing with age, his movements deliberate and thoughtful. His eyes, though deep amber and endlessly patient, held a steadiness that often anchored Henry when nothing else could. Duke's ears flicked occasionally as people walked by, but he remained calm, head resting on his paws, exuding that solemn, unmistakable aura of a retired working dog who had once been trained to run toward chaos without hesitation. The auction room was warmer than the hallway, yet no less uncomfortable. The air smelled faintly of damp coats, old carpet, and stale office coffee, an unromantic blend that reminded Henry of too many VA waiting rooms he'd sat in over the years. Around him were locals, farmers with wind-burned skin, real estate scouts in crisp jackets, too thin for Minnesota winter, and lifelong Duluth residents, bundled in heavy flannel. They eyed him with restrained curiosity, this gray-haired outsider with a working dog at his heel. This man who didn't fidget or chat or check his phone, who just waited. Henry wasn't here for the trucks or tools or repossessed snowmobiles. He had only one target. One listing he had discovered deep in the county ledger like a whisper from fate itself. Parcel 9B, the old Fairmont cabin. A place he had never seen but somehow felt drawn to, as if the world had quietly nudged him toward it. And then the auctioneer, a short, heavy-set man named Marcus, with a thinning hairline and a mustache so large it seemed to have its own personality, cleared his throat. Marcus was known around the county for his booming theatrical voice and his restless showman's energy, the kind that usually filled the room with lively banter. But today, when he reached the line for Parcel 9B, something in his demeanor faltered. His voice dropped. His shoulders stiffened. Even his mustache seemed to wilt. "Next item," Marcus said with a sigh, glancing at the paper as if hoping it would rewrite itself. Parcel 9B, the old Fairmont cabin. 15 years delinquent in taxes. Opening bid $500. A hush fell over the room so quickly it felt unnatural. Heads turned. Conversations died mid-sentence. It wasn't fear exactly, but unease, a collective tightening of muscles and breath. Henry felt it like a cold draft moving between bodies, a silent warning. He raised his hand. Calm, steady, 500. Marcus looked up, his tired eyes scanning the crowd for a competing bid he clearly knew wouldn't come. Do I hear 6? Silence. Thick and heavy. The kind that held memories, rumors, history. Henry could feel people staring at him now, not with envy or annoyance, but with a strange, almost sorrowful pity, as if he were willingly stepping onto thin ice they all knew would crack. Going once, Marcus said quickly. Going twice. A man in the front row, a tall, weather-beaten rancher in a stained denim jacket, caught Henry's gaze and gave the faintest shake of his head, a final silent attempt to dissuade him. Sold, Marcus declared, the gavel cracking down like a judge's final sentence. To the gentleman in the back, for 500. Duke lifted his head, sensing the shift in energy. Henry reached down and brushed his fingers through the thick fur between the dog's ears. It felt symbolic somehow, an anchor, a reassurance that he wasn't walking into this alone. When Henry stepped up to sign the papers, the mood in the room broke into hushed murmurs. Fragments drifted behind him like smoke from an old fire. Doesn't know what he's bought. Fairmont Place. Cursed. Should have left it alone. The young clerk who handed Henry the deed could barely make eye contact. She pushed the paper toward him with stiff fingers, her face pale and tense as though touching the document might carry misfortune. He thanked her anyway gently, because he had learned long ago that even fearful people deserved kindness. Henry and Duke stepped back into the icy evening air. The wind from Lake Superior whipped through the street cold enough to sting even through Henry's heavy coat. It carried the scent of snow pine and distant water, an old northern smell he had grown to love. He pulled his scarf tighter and headed down the block to the general store he'd seen earlier. Abernathy's General Store was older than many of the buildings around it, its sign faded, and its windows fogged from the heat inside. When Henry opened the door, a warm burst of sawdust and roasted coffee greeted him, comforting in its simplicity. Behind the counter stood Walter Abernathy, the shop's owner. Walter was in his late 70s with a long, narrow face, marked by deep wrinkles, and a pair of bushy gray eyebrows that gave him a permanently skeptical look. His hands were large and knotted the hands of a man who had spent most of his life splitting wood, fixing machinery, and shoveling snow before dawn. Walter studied Henry as he approached the counter, his sharp blue eyes flicking between the old veteran and the German shepherd at his side. "Afternoon," Walter said. His voice was gravelly but warm, like the hum of an old truck engine. "What can I get for you today?" Henry pulled a folded list from his pocket oil for the lamps, a sturdy padlock, coffee beans, and a new axe handle. He placed it on the counter. I just bought a place up north. Thought I'd stock up before heading out." Walter read the list, then lifted his gaze again. "You're the fella who bought the Fairmont cabin, aren't you?" Henry hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, that's me." A long silence stretched out. Walter's expression changed, first surprise, then concern, then something heavier. "Son," he said quietly, even though Henry was older than him in spirit, if not in years, you should know. "That land has a story." Henry braced himself. "I'm listening." Walter leaned against the counter, his brows furrowing. It belonged to a journalist, Thomas Miller. Smart, persistent man. Too persistent, some say. He was looking into things folks around here didn't want looked into. Then one day, he just disappeared. Left his truck, his coat, his tools. 15 years and not a trace since. Henry felt Duke press lightly against his leg, as if sensing the darkness in the words. Walter continued, his voice low. "That place has been sittin' untouched ever since. People claim it's haunted. Others say it's cursed. But me," he tapped his temple with a calloused finger, "I think someone wanted it forgotten." Henry exhaled slowly, absorbing the weight of the story. Yet something inside him, some old instinct from his service years, tightened not with fear, but purpose. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "but I'll take my chances." Walter sighed but didn't argue. He simply bagged Henry's items, gave Duke a small treat from a jar, and said quietly, "Be careful up there. Some things don't stay buried forever." Henry nodded, stepped back into the cold with Duke, and walked toward his truck. Snow drifted softly from the sky, settling on his coat, on Duke's fur, on the deed that now felt heavier in his pocket. He didn't yet understand the looks of pity or the warnings or the silence that had greeted his winning bid. But he would. Very soon he would. And the truth waiting for him in that abandoned cabin would change everything. The drive northward pulled Henry Walker and his old German shepherd Duke deeper into the frozen wilderness, until Duluth's last streetlight vanished behind a curtain of drifting snow. The sky had shifted to a darker gray since morning, the kind that promised more than just cold, it promised a storm. His old pickup truck rattled and groaned with each mile as though it knew the land ahead had devoured braver machines before. The highway became a rural road, then a gravel path, and finally a narrow, uneven trail swallowed by towering pine trees buried under thick winter snow. Their branches sagged like they carried the weight of years, not months of ice. Henry felt the vibration of unease settle into his ribs the farther he drove. He had spent his life reading landscapes, deserts, mountains, war zones, cities, and something here felt wrong. The first obstacle was the fallen pine trunk lying across the path. It was thick old and placed at an angle that didn't make sense for a natural fall. The storm last week could have taken it down, but its clean break and perfect positioning raised every instinct Henry still possessed from years in combat. He maneuvered the truck around it with careful precision. Duke lifting his head from the passenger seat and letting out a low rumble, not quite a growl, but a vocalization of acknowledgement. Next came the thorn bushes, dense, clustered, too deliberate. Their branches were full of small, hard berries, and they grew in a pattern Henry had seen before, human-designed deterrents meant to frustrate rather than block. For whom, though, and why no one lived this deep into the woods? Or rather, no one should have. When the forest finally spit them into a clearing, the cabin appeared like a wounded relic. Its roof sagged on one side. The front porch leaned forward, as if bowing under invisible burdens, and the chimney, a towering structure of stacked river stones, wore a thick coat of dark green moss. Snow clung stubbornly to every surface, muting the colors, until everything seemed washed in gray. The place felt paused, trapped in the exact moment its owner had vanished. Henry sat in the truck for a long minute, watching the cabin with the scrutiny of someone approaching an enemy bunker, not a winter home. Duke sat rigid beside him, eyes fixed forward, ears sharp. "Well, boy," Henry finally murmured, "this is it." Duke gave a single huff, somewhere between agreement and warning. Up close, the cabin was even more unsettling. The wooden steps creaked loudly, complaining under Henry's weight. He opened the door slowly, no squeal of rust, no violent jolt. It swung inward with a soft sigh like someone had opened it only yesterday. The first thing he saw was the table. On it sat a ceramic mug, its faded blue rim chipped in one spot. A ring of old coffee residue clung to the bottom. Beside it lay an open book, still face down, as though its reader had only paused for a moment. The pages had curled from years of cold and humidity, yet the placement felt freshly interrupted. A heavy wool coat hung behind the door, brown, well-used one pocket, noticeably stretched by something once carried inside. Dust rested on everything but thinly, gently, as if the house itself had been holding its breath. Thomas Miller had left in a hurry, or he had never left at all. Henry's throat tightened, an old and unwelcome sensation. It reminded him of the first time he'd entered an empty barracks after an ambush overseas, beds neatly made, letters still on desks, boots still lined up beneath them, lives cut off mid-sentence. He walked slowly across the creaking floorboards, each step echoing slightly in the stillness. His heart beat a little too loud in his ears, not out of fear, but recognition. This was a place touched by something unresolved, something trapped. Duke wandered in behind him, sniffing quietly at corners and damp patches in the wood. His behavior was normal at first, methodical, curious, professional. But then the temperature inside seemed to shift, though Henry suspected it was his imagination. The air by the stone fireplace felt heavier, colder. Duke stopped moving, his ears pinned back. The fur along his spine rose like a row of broken quills, his posture hardened, muscles tightening beneath the thick coat. Henry felt the change before he saw it. Duke's tail had lowered, his eyes fixed on one precise spot at the foot of the fireplace. "What is it, boy?" Henry asked in a low voice, already knowing it wasn't a small thing. Duke moved forward slowly, sniffing with sharp, rapid breaths, then planting his front paws firmly on the large rectangular stone embedded in the cabin floor. He scratched once lightly, then again harder. Henry's pulse quickened. Duke did not behave this way for mice or raccoons. He never scratched without reason, never reacted instinctively without history behind it. This was the same posture he used overseas when detecting hidden caches, ammunition under dirt floors, weapons buried beneath crates, the presence of danger the human nose could never sense. Henry kneeled, brushing his fingers over the stone. It was cold, colder than the stones around it. He leaned closer, noticing a faint line of darker mortar running around the edges. Not the original mix. A repair. No. A seal. Duke began pacing in a tight circle before returning to the stone, letting out a soft whine of urgency, almost pleading. Henry closed his eyes briefly. "Okay," he murmured to him. "I hear you." But the storm outside was already rising, snow tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Henry knew better than to dig into anything literally or figuratively before securing shelter. The firewood pile on the porch would barely last the night. They would need warmth. They would need time. They would need safety. The moment he lit the fire, Duke's tension shifted from alertness to agitation. Flames licked the inside of the fireplace, crackling through dry scraps left behind by someone else 15 years ago. Duke paced, then circled, then pawed again at the stone, faster, harder, whining in short bursts between each attempt. Henry's chest tightened. He had survived ambushes and lost platoon members. He had endured all manners of chaos, but Duke's behavior hit something deeper, older in his gut. Something primal whispered through him. There is something beneath your feet. Something hidden. Something someone didn't want found. The wind howled harder, rattling loose boards. Snow thickened outside the windows until the world disappeared behind a shifting white veil. The cabin, small as it was, seemed to shrink further, the walls pressing inward. The fire warmed the air, but not the atmosphere. Duke paused only once to press his head into Henry's leg, the weight of his body grounding but trembling faintly. Then he returned to the stone as though it were calling to him alone. Henry crouched beside him once more, tracing the edge of the hearthstone with a gloved hand. Something inside him, an old soldier's instinct sharpened by years of trusting this exact dog with his life, settled into certainty. Something waited beneath that slab. Something no blizzard could hide. And tomorrow, when the storm eased, he would find out exactly what. The storm outside raged with a ferocity that made the cabin walls tremble. But inside, Henry Walker felt a different kind of storm, brewing this one quiet, deliberate, and pulsing, beneath the cold stone of the hearth. Duke's agitation hadn't eased. He remained poised with taut muscles and sharp breathing, urging his human partner toward the truth he'd sensed from the start. Henry trusted that instinct more than he trusted most people, and certainly more than he trusted the silence of this forgotten house. He gathered what he needed from the truck, a lantern, his old multi-tool, and the long iron pry bar he had carried through a dozen campsites and countless winters, as Duke hovered close, tail-rigid eyes, never leaving the hearth. The stone at the center felt unnaturally cold, even as the fire dwindled beside it. Henry knelt, the stiff ache in his knees flaring, but he ignored it. He traced the mortar line with his thumb. It was darker than the others, smoother with a faint rubbery give beneath the blade of his multi-tool. Not stone, sealant. Someone had sealed this intentionally. As he scraped and chipped, Duke's tension escalated into a low, vibrating growl, not aggressive but anticipatory, like a soldier watching a locked door about to open on the other side of a battlefield. When the seal finally cracked and Henry wedged the pry bar beneath the slab, the stone lifted with a long, metallic groan. Cold air rushed from below, carrying with it a smell Henry recognized instantly: old metal, dry earth, and the faint must of trapped years. He heaved the slab aside and shone the lantern down. Beneath lay a narrow, stone-lined cavity constructed deliberately, like a miniature bunker sealed away from the world. Inside were two items: a dark green military-grade metal case with reinforced edges and a bundle of leather-bound journals tied together with brittle twine. Duke exhaled a low chuff of relief, tail beginning a slow wag, as if satisfied that his warning had been answered. Henry lifted the journals out carefully, before retrieving the box setting, both on the table where the mug and half-read book still waited like props from a life interrupted. The leather was worn soft at the edges, and the journals looked handmade, stitched, not glued. He opened the first one. The handwriting was neat, small, and tightly packed. Thomas Miller, the lost journalist whose disappearance had turned into a whispering warning for anyone who dared approach this cabin. The first entries were simple musings about winter, about the northern silence, the isolation of choosing to live where the world forgot to look. There were observations about animal tracks in the snow, the changing color of pine bark in cold weather, and quiet reflections on living alone, reflections Henry understood too well. But then somewhere around the third journal, the tone shifted. The script grew tighter, angrier, the ink pressed harder into the page. Miller wrote that a mining company, Northlake Mining, had shown unexpected interest in his land. He described random inspections turning into harassment, first a chimney violation for a chimney older than half the county, then accusations about septic issues that had never existed, then mysterious new property line documents that cut his acreage by a third. Miller wrote about the men who came county inspectors with stiff movements and rehearsed politeness, including one tall man with a birthmark on his jaw, who always wore a navy jacket. He described their faces, their clipped voices, and the way they watched the cabin as though trying to see through the walls. When Henry reached the part where Miller wrote, "They are trying to push me out. Someone wants this land. Someone with power. And they won't come at me openly, they use paperwork, fines, warnings." A quiet suffocation. He felt a pressure settle in his chest. He had seen this tactic before with far less subtlety in countries where corruption hid its face behind uniforms and official stamps. He turned to the next journal. The pages grew darker. Miller had begun collecting water. Samples from creek springs, small tributaries near the mining operation. He detailed strange discolorations, dead fish and patches of soil that smelled metallic even in deep winter. And then tests lab reports from an independent facility in Bozeman. Henry reached for the metal box and opened it. Inside were neatly arranged rows of vials, each filled with an oily, blackish liquid, each labeled with dates and coordinates. There were envelopes containing thick sheets of paper, water reports showing arsenic levels dozens of times higher than acceptable limits, lead concentrations that could sicken entire families, industrial solvents, whose names Henry couldn't pronounce, but whose threat was unmistakable. Beneath the papers was a rolled map. He uncurled it slowly. Red circles dotted the landscape around Duluth Springs, streams, ponds, connected in a pattern that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. A web spreading outward like veins poisoned from the heart of an unseen wound. Henry felt his breath catch. He found something, he whispered. Duke pressed his chin on Henry's thigh, sensing the shift in his human's heartbeat. Miller had uncovered a pattern of contamination so large it could choke an entire city's water supply. And then the man vanished. Henry stared at the table, the journals spread open beneath the lantern's glow, their shadows trembling with the shuddering wind. There were no signs of struggle in the cabin. But there didn't need to be. People who threatened powerful interests didn't always disappear with a fight. Sometimes they were silenced by opportunity, by careful planning, by isolation. The storm outside thickened, burying the windows under snow. The cabin rumbled as a strong gust hit its side. Duke's sudden growl came before Henry even heard the sound. A distant engine, too heavy, too intentional for a lost traveler in a blizzard. Henry's muscles tightened, years of training snapping awake. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into shadow. Duke moved closer to the door, his hackles rising. Then a knock. 3 hard pounds against the wooden door. Henry unbolted it, cautiously opening it only a few inches. A large man stood outside, snow gathering in the folds of his coat. Sheriff Clarence Barnes. Barnes was in his early 50s, heavy-set, with a round face reddened by cold and a thick brown mustache that curled slightly at the ends. He had small eyes deep-set beneath heavy brows, and they held a watchfulness that felt anything but friendly. His uniform coat strained slightly at the shoulders, and a silver badge glinted under the porch light. "Evenin', Barnes," said, voice deep and gravelly. "Storm's bad. Thought I'd check on the new owner before he freezes." Henry stepped aside, but only slightly. "Appreciate it," he said. "Didn't expect visitors." Barnes sniffed once, a strange animal-like reflex, and glanced inside. "Cabin like this, surprises tend to turn up. You find anything interesting tonight?" His tone was casual, but the sharpness in his gaze was a blade sliding under the words. Duke's growl deepened. Barnes eyed him. "Good dog you got there." "Best partner I ever had," Henry replied evenly. "Keeps an eye on things." Barnes's jaw tightened. He wiped snow from his hat, though more settled instantly. "Well, roads are rough. Shouldn't stay here long. This place has a history. Folks say the last owner left in a hurry. So I heard." Barnes stared a moment longer, then muttered, "Stay safe out here," and trudged back through the snow to his county SUV. Henry closed the door. His chest felt tight. Duke pushed against his leg. Something was off. Something very off. Instinct drove him outside into the cutting wind. Snow swirled like white smoke. He crouched by his truck and brushed the snow away from the tires. The front ones were fine. The back right cut. A clean slice. Not from rock. Not from age. From a knife. A message. A threat. A warning, leave. Or else. Henry stared toward the empty trail where Barnes's SUV had disappeared. Duke pressed against him, steady but tense. Henry whispered, "We're not alone anymore." and the truth beneath the stone hearth felt colder than the snow under his knees. The morning after the storm, the forest stood unnervingly still. Tall pines bowed under the weight of fresh snow, their branches creaking softly in the cold wind. The sky above was a pale silver washed clean by the blizzard, and the air carried a quiet that felt less like peace and more like anticipation. Henry Walker stepped out onto the porch of the cabin, his breath forming small puffs that drifted into the frozen air. Duke padded beside him, sniffing the new layer of snow, ears perked and alert. It was the kind of silence Henry had known before, right before something dangerous stepped into view. And it didn't take long. The growl of an engine thundered through the trees, sharp and out of place in the tranquil clearing. Duke stiffened instantly, tail low but steady. Soon a sleek black pickup truck, new polished, and very much not a local vehicle, slid into the clearing, as if it owned the land it rolled across. The contrast between the luxury machine and the battered cabin was almost insulting. Henry narrowed his eyes. From the driver's door stepped Richard Cole, a man whose presence seemed designed to dominate a room even in the middle of a frozen wilderness. Cole was in his mid-50s, tall, with a straight posture that suggested a life of commanding boardrooms rather than weathering storms. His silver hair was neatly combed, his jaw clean-shaven, and his skin carried the faint tan of someone who spent winter vacations somewhere warm, certainly not in Minnesota. His coat looked expensive, tailored, and untouched by snow, despite the storm which made Henry immediately suspicious. It meant Cole had either waited deliberately for the storm to ease, or was too well connected to ever suffer inconvenience. Cole wore a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Walker, I presume." His voice was smooth, practiced, honed by years of giving speeches to investors rather than ordinary people. Henry didn't return the smile. "Who's asking?" Richard Cole spread his arms expansively, as if greeting an old friend. "Richard Cole, CEO of Northlake Mining." He paused, waiting for the name to land with the weight he thought it deserved. It did, but not in the way Cole expected. Henry's expression hardened. Duke let out a low growl. Cole gave Duke a cursory glance and chuckled. "Good dog. Looks like he's protective. Wonderful trait." He stepped closer, brushing a speck of non-existent dust from his sleek coat. "I'm here to make you an offer. A very generous one." Henry folded his arms over his chest. "Not interested." Cole laughed softly, shaking his head, as though Henry were a stubborn child. "You haven't even heard it yet." He reached into his coat and pulled out a white envelope, thick, bulging, too stuffed to be anything but money. He held it out, letting Henry see the faint glimmer of cash. $50,000. Cash. Right now. For this property you bought for a mere $500. Henry didn't move. Cole's smile faltered slightly. "It's a good deal, Mr. Walker. A very good deal. This land is complicated. Hard to maintain. Harder to survive in. Let me take it off your hands." His tone softened, oiled with persuasive charm. "Think of what this could mean for you. A warm home in Florida. Sunshine. Comfort. Retirement the way it was meant to be lived." Henry stared at him for a long moment. Then he said simply, Cole blinked. The smile slipped entirely this time. "No. Not for sale." Cole's eyes hardened into narrow, calculating slits. The polished facade cracked, revealing a man unused to opposition. "Mr. Walker," he said slowly, "some people don't know when to walk away. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Duke stepped forward, then positioning himself slightly ahead of Henry. Cole took note. He didn't smile. He didn't laugh. He simply stared for a beat too long, silently conveying a promise of trouble. Then he turned on his heel, walked back to his truck, with stiff movements, and slammed the door hard enough to shake the glass. As the truck roared back toward the forest trail, Henry watched until the engine faded into distant echoes. Duke nudged his hand, sensing the tension coiling inside him. "I know, boy," Henry murmured. "This isn't over." He glanced toward the cabin, the journals inside, the samples, the map, the secrets Miller had died for. Cole wasn't here to buy land. He was here to bury evidence. And Henry had just become a threat. The next morning, with the storm easing slightly, Henry made a decision. He wasn't going to sit and wait for men like Cole to come knocking again, not while holding evidence that could destroy them. He fed Duke scratched behind his ears and knelt in front of him. "Stay," he said firmly. Duke whined, not wanting to be left, but Henry needed him to guard the cabin, needed him to be safe. Henry loaded the journals, selected samples, and the map into his pack and walked to the truck. Snow crunched under his boots, the sound too loud in the tense morning air. He drove slowly, carefully, taking several back roads and detours he instinctively used when he didn't want to be followed. It was a habit from another life, one that had never left him. His destination, a public library in Duluth, small, quiet, and frequently overlooked. Inside, the warm air smelled of old books and carpet glue. Only 2 patrons were present. A college-aged girl with large glasses and tangled brown hair, hunched over her laptop, and an elderly man asleep in a chair near the radiator. The librarian, Marjorie Blake, sat behind the desk. Marjorie was in her 60s, petite with soft gray curls and warm hazel eyes behind thin-framed glasses. Her knitted sweater was lavender, and she wore a silver chain around her neck. She had a gentle demeanor, the kind of person who whispered even when she wasn't in a library, and she gave Henry a pleasant smile. "Good morning," she said. "Cold out there today." "Colder than it looks," Henry replied. Marjorie gestured toward the row of computers. "Help yourself. Let me know if you need anything." Henry settled at the farthest computer. He slid a small USB scanner he'd brought into the port and began scanning the most critical pages, the lab reports, the contamination map, the most damning journal entries. Each click of the scanner echoed faintly against the shelves. He transferred the files into an encrypted folder. Then he opened an email client and typed in an address he knew by heart. David Collins. David had once been the sharpest soldier in their unit, quick-thinking, fearless, the guy who could fix a radio under gunfire or extract a wounded teammate with nothing but instinct. When the war ended, David didn't stop fighting. He turned his skills toward journalism, ripping the masks off corrupt officials and crooked corporations. He lost a marriage along the way, gained enemies he couldn't count, and earned a reputation for exposing the kind of darkness polite society preferred to ignore. Henry trusted him with one thing: truth. He attached the files, encrypted the message, and set a timed lock requiring their old shared military passphrase. Then he stood, walked out of the library, and used a prepaid phone to call David. David's voice was older now, rougher, deeper, but still carried the bite of a man who refused to break. "Henry," he said, "it's been years." "Wish I were calling for a better reason," Henry replied. He explained everything: Miller, the contamination, Northlake mining, Barnes coal. David listened without interrupting. When Henry finished, David said only, "Give me the phrase. Eagle 7. Delta Stone." Silence. Then David exhaled sharply. "Damn it, Henry. You stepped into something big." "Didn't step in," Henry said. "It found me." David's tone hardened. If you don't call me by 6 a.m. tomorrow, I send everything to the FBI, not the local cops, straight to federal, and I'll bring heat down on Northlake like they've never seen." "That's the plan," Henry replied. And Henry, "Yeah, watch your back. They won't stop now." Henry ended the call, removed the phone battery, tossed the pieces into 2 different trash bins across town, then drove back toward the cabin. The wind picked up again. Snow swirled. Night crept across the sky like a closing fist. And through the storm, Henry saw Duke waiting at the cabin door, solid, vigilant, loyal as ever. The second soldier holding the line. The second blizzard arrived without mercy, swallowing the forest in white fury, as if the northern wilderness itself wanted to erase every trace of the cabin and the man inside it. Snow whipped across the clearing in violent spirals, and the pine trees groaned under the weight of ice, bowing like weary giants. The wind screamed against the cabin's wooden walls, a long, hollow wail that reminded Henry Walker of distant battlefields, those moments before an ambush when nature held its breath but your instincts screamed otherwise. Inside the cabin, Henry moved with steady, practiced motions. His joints ached from the cold, his knees especially old wounds that never healed right after crawling through too many deserts and too much enemy fire, but his hands remained firm. He secured the last wooden plank across the front window, testing its strength with a shove. Behind him, Duke lay near the hearth, not asleep, merely conserving energy as he always did before danger. The aging German shepherd, 9 years old, with a thick winter coat of smoky black and gray, rested his chin on his paws, but his ears, remained upright, listening, translating every shift of the storm into meaning. Henry checked his old hunting rifle again, running his thumb along the cold metal, remembering the last time he'd held a weapon in an enclosed room while waiting for men to try breaking down his door. Duluth was a long way from Afghanistan, and yet tonight felt eerily similar, cold, uncertain, deadly. Around midnight, Duke's eyes snapped open. His whole body stiffened, and a deep, vibrating growl started in his chest. He rose to his feet with a slow, deliberate movement that made Henry's pulse spike. "What is it, boy?" Henry whispered, though he already knew. Duke turned not toward the front door or the window Henry had barricaded, but toward the small back window near the thicket of spruce trees. It was the window Henry had always dismissed, thinking no one would be foolish enough to try crossing the deep snow and thorny brush behind the cabin. But tonight, someone was desperate enough. A thud, then another. Heavy footsteps, muffled by snow but unmistakably human, approached from behind the cabin. Henry grabbed the rifle and positioned himself away from the direct line of sight. Duke pressed close, his hackles raised. A murmur of voices cut through the howling wind. Men. At least 3. Then glass shattered. The small back window exploded, inward shards hitting the floor. A bottle crashed inside, spilling the sharp, unmistakable scent of lamp oil across the wood. "Damn it!" Henry hissed. A dark figure was halfway through the window before he even finished the thought. The man was large, broad-chested, dressed head to toe in black. He wore a knitted ski mask, and his eyes, sharp, predatory, gleamed with cold purpose. But he never made it fully inside. Duke lunged. The old shepherd slammed into the man with such force that both hit the floorboards. Duke's jaws locked around the intruder's forearm, the arm holding the pistol. There was a sickening crunch, followed by a scream muffled by the storm. The gun clattered away. "Good boy, don't let go," Henry barked, swinging the rifle to cover the window just as the shouting outside grew louder. "I don't care how burn it," a voice roared. It was unmistakable. Richard Cole. The carefully groomed CEO was gone. This was a man stripped of corporate polish, replaced by raw desperation and greed. Then came the splash of more oil, followed by fire. A flaming rag sailed through the broken window and hit the oil-soaked floor. Flames erupted instantly, racing across the wood like starving beasts. The cabin, dry, old, and weary from a century of winters, went up faster than Henry could blink. Smoke filled his lungs, searing hot. The temperature spiked. The fire roared. Henry grabbed Duke by the scruff, yelling, "Leave him!" Duke released the intruder's arm and backed up as Henry kicked the groaning man toward the spreading flames. "Give him back to your boss," Henry spat. As the fire consumed the wooden beams above, Henry threw his shoulder into the front door and burst outside into the blinding snow. Duke bounded beside him, staying glued to Henry's leg like a seasoned soldier. The scene outside was apocalyptic. Behind them, the cabin burned like a massive funeral pyre, flames clawing at the sky, turning the snow orange. Ahead of them stood Cole and two hired guns, weapons raised. Cole's face was flushed red with fury, his slick hair plastered to his forehead by snow, his expensive jacket stained with soot. "You're done, Walker," Cole screamed over the storm. "The evidence is gone. The cabin is ash. Nobody is coming for you now." Henry raised his rifle, prepared to take at least one of them down. He'd die doing something that mattered. He'd die buying time for the truth to reach David. It would be enough. And then a thunderous, rhythmic thump filled the sky. The ground trembled. Snow swirled violently as twin lights pierced through the blizzard clouds. Two helicopters descended. The first bore the blue and white insignia of the Minnesota State Patrol. The second was larger, darker, no visible markings, but the floodlights and the precise formation told Henry everything: federal agents. A booming loudspeaker shattered the night. "This is the FBI. Drop your weapons, hands in the air." Cole froze. His men dropped their guns instantly. Cole stood there, trembling, rage and disbelief tearing across his face. He seemed to realize in slow motion that his years of control, of intimidation, of corruption had shattered in a single instant. Then, with a strangled, defeated roar, he flung his gun into the snow and raised his hands. Agents stormed the clearing. Fire crews battled the inferno. Snow melted around the burning remains of the cabin. The clearing swarmed with uniforms, lights, voices. Someone ushered Henry toward the agents for safety, while others tended to the injured thug inside. An FBI agent approached a tall, steady man with sandy hair, narrow eyes, and a firm voice. Agent Rowan Pierce, mid-40s, with a soldier's bearing and the serious calm of someone who had seen too much but never backed down. "Are you Mr. Walker?" he asked. Henry nodded. "The evidence you're looking for, it's under the chimney stone. Fire didn't reach it." Pierce gave him a sharp, respectful look. "Sir, you just saved a lot of people." Weeks passed. Snow softened, revealing the first hints of green around the charred site of the old cabin. News trucks had come and gone. North Lake Mining collapsed under the weight of criminal indictments. Sheriff Barnes and several officials were arrested. Cole started naming bigger names, men with suits and senatorial titles. In early spring, David Collins arrived. His beard was thicker now, peppered with gray, and he walked with the careful stiffness of a man who had spent too many years hunched over keyboards chasing ghosts of corruption. But his eyes, sharp, precise, impossible to intimidate, were exactly as Henry remembered. "You know," David said, gazing at the blackened foundation, "they're calling you a hero." Henry shook his head, petting Duke's thick fur. "The hero was the journalist who died, and this old dog who didn't." David smiled. "So what now?" Henry looked at the land, the cleared path, the tall trees swaying gently, the faint smell of spring. "I'm staying," he said. "Going to rebuild, and maybe make this a place where old veterans and old dogs can rest." Duke nudged Henry's leg, then lay down with a sigh. Home wasn't a roof. It was a promise. And this ground, scarred, burned, but still standing, was where that promise would be kept. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't arrive as flashes of light or booming voices from the heavens, they come quietly through the loyalty of an old dog, the courage of a weary man, or the strength God places in our hearts when we feel most alone. Henry thought he was buying an abandoned cabin, but what he truly found was a reminder that God's grace often works in hidden ways, guiding our steps, protecting us in the storm, and sending help exactly when we need it, even if it arrives in the form of a loyal German shepherd or a friend answering a call at the right moment. And maybe that's the message for all of us today. In our daily lives, through the long nights, the bills, the loneliness, the quiet worries, we forget that God still moves in small, gentle miracles. A kind word, a door opening when another one closes, a stranger who shows up with an answer, a moment of courage we didn't know we had. If Henry and Duke's story touched your heart, let it be a reminder that you are never walking alone. May God bless you, guide your steps, and place His protection over your home, your family, and everyone you love. And may He send you your own Duke in life, whatever form that miracle takes. Before you leave, we would be truly grateful if you could help this little storytelling family grow. Share this video with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story. May God watch over you, keep you safe, and fill your days with quiet miracles. Amen.